Okay, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker. Steve Rochlin is co-CEO and co-founder of IO Sustainability. And IO stands for Impacts and Outcomes for Sustainable Development. And his firm identifies strategic solutions for the private, public, and civil sectors organizations that maximize economic, social, and environmental value for the long term. Steve has more than 20 years of experience in sustainability and corporate responsibility. And he's advised leading companies across a wide variety of industry sectors on how to improve sustainability performance in a way that drives competitive success. He's also the co-author of 2 books on the topics, Beyond Good Company, Next Generation Corporate Citizenship, and Untapped, Creating Value in Underserved Markets. Without further ado, Steve Rochlin.
So I'm extremely happy to be here. This is my 3rd Plasticity conference and the 3rd time I've been so honored to be a speaker, first in Hong Kong and then in New York. So I'm something of a Plasticity groupie. And very, very happy to be here in Dallas. Thank you so much to Doug Woodring and the Ocean Recovery Alliance. Thank you so much to Trammell Crow and the myriad sponsors who are supporting this incredibly important conversation. And I will get to my talk in very, very short order because I'm much more interested in hearing the other individuals on the agenda. What I'd like to do is to provide a little bit of context. There is an enormously strong and exciting business case for more circular approaches, particularly applied to plastic waste stream. We know that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has estimated that it's about a $1 trillion opportunity annually. We've seen other analysis that says if you look at some of the positive revenue opportunities from this and include those, that market grows even more than that. At the same time, we know that in really any facet of sustainability, whether we're talking about more circular approaches with plastic or we're talking about other kinds of environmental and social investments, that there's a challenge trying to break past the established modes of working and thinking. That if we look at even the signature leaders in this space that get much of the praise and acknowledgement for their leadership in this area, if we look across their organizational operational systems, this kind of thinking has not become embedded across the organization, hasn't become scaled yet. So one of the things that I want to do to kick off the conversation today is to say, well, what do we need to do to get to that scale? And I don't have the entire answer to that, but there is at least one thing that I want to emphasize and feature. And that is that when we start talking about trillion-dollar markets, multi-trillion-dollar markets, this definitely gets the attention of those who are in the field of investment and those who are in the startup community and those who are in established businesses, certainly and absolutely. But it's also abstract. And so every kind of organization needs to translate this opportunity to their context and their particular opportunity. They need to execute on this. If we're talking to a particular kind of industry that has an established mode of working, that has, for example, more long-term assets that they use and sort of sweat for years and years and years, trying to pivot and transition and adopt these kinds of approaches can actually seem more like a strain than an opportunity, even if there is a sexy number at the end of a discounted cash flow model for them. So one of the things that we're trying to do in this is to see if we can overwhelm business and decision makers and leaders with business case opportunities in this kind of area. We think we can have a better opportunity to make these kinds of decisions and strategies to invest in more circular and sustainable approaches a no-brainer, no doubter, and it's something that you just can't say no to. So this is where our project called Project ROI comes into. This was an initiative that we led at IO Sustainability with our partners from Babson College. Babson is the #1 ranked business school for entrepreneurship. And it was supported by sponsors, our lead sponsor Verizon and our supporting sponsor Campbell Soup. And Verizon and Campbell Soup are 2 great tastes that taste great together. And our focus was to say, how can we get at this conversation about metrics for return on investment and the business case that C-suite leaders will believe and embrace? And so our process, which was very elaborate, which I'll summarize too briefly, started by doing really two things. Number one is actually doing a survey, doing interviews directly with a number of CEOs, CFOs, chief marketing officers from a variety of large industries, from chemical to automotive to media to food to tech to a variety of others, and saying, what is it that you need to see to be convinced? One of the things that they directed us to do is to say, actually, don't do an original study. There's too many studies out there. And what we feel is that those that we engage with are cherry picking them. Our board of directors often cherry pick the few negative studies that show a negative association with this type of thinking and bottom line results. And the good news is that there are not many of those studies out there. They say that our own teams and those advising our teams are cherry picking just 3 or 4 or 5 studies that show them in the best light. So what we'd like you to do actually is to do more of a study of studies, more of a meta-type analysis to see what's out there. And so that's what we did. And the long story short is we looked at over 300 studies. We looked at studies that were, for the most part, conducted in the last 5 years, if you go further back, because those studies tend to have the most rigorous methodologies. We looked in a variety of different areas, and we translated them to results that executives understand. We translated them to the kind of metrics that executives use. Now, there's a few headlines in terms of what we learned from this. The major headline is that sustainability, and this includes circular type approaches across the board, can deliver supernormal, outstanding returns on investment for businesses if they are done well. And I think that this caveat is actually one of the best news that we found, because so many studies that we have seen in the past try and present that any kind of activity that we do in this space is going to be good and lead to flowers blooming and to paradise and rainbows. And actually that's not the case. No other part of the business actually gets top quality results no matter what they do. They don't win just by showing up. And we learned that that is absolutely true of sustainability and circular approaches as well. We've got to do them well. The next thing that we did is we looked at, well, what goes into doing it well. And so this is a report that you can see my email up on the screen. This is a report that we've disseminated widely. It's gotten very, very good uptake. It's been written up in Forbes and Inc. and a number of other business journals, getting a lot of positive feedback. And I'd be happy to share a copy with you for free for the report. Just contact me afterwards. What I want to try and do is relate what we've learned from that particular research to the conversation that we're having today. And so the first area that we dove into was looking at share price. And when we looked at share price, we found some very, very interesting things. That when we did our assessment and our study of studies, we targeted that for companies that do this well and are seen as being leaders in their approach and executing on this in with certain kinds of processes and strategies, that the potential is to increase their share price by up to 6% year on and year out versus peers and competitors. Now, there's a few factors that go into achieving this. And one of the things that we learned, which was very interesting, is that if you can imagine 3 kinds of companies, one that is a leader in adopting these approaches, one that is a laggard, and one that is sort of half in and half out, just trying to keep up, what we found is that who wins, who creates the most value is the leader. Who creates the second most value is the laggard. And coming up in the rear actually is those who are half in and half out. And that was surprising, but actually started to make sense, because those companies are the ones who are probably doing it for the wrong reasons, probably doing it just as sort of a Me Too type exercise to cover their backsides. And they're not getting the full benefits either from their business stakeholders or from their external community and NGO stakeholders. So when we start seeing this, one of the things that we learn is that very few companies actually engage with their investors in a constructive and strategic way on this topic. In fact, many companies that we work with in their boardrooms say that actually our investors are not asking us about this. So how are these results possible? Well, there's a couple of things that are going on that I think have real implications for our discussion. The first is that investors are seeing this as a proxy for how companies are managing intangible assets like reputation, war for talent, innovation, and others like that. The other thing that they're using this as a proxy for is to assess the quality of the leadership team, which is something that a CEO can love in terms of stroking his or her ego. There's a real opportunity to show that investors see companies that do this effectively as having leadership with foresight, seeing around corners, anticipating unseen opportunities and risks, and being incredibly strategic. And the way that we're seeing companies have success in terms of getting value with investors in this area, I think would be near and dear to those working on circular approaches, because circular approaches can really focus not on the sustainability benefits with investors, and not even use the word circular. You don't even have to come to an investor and talk about our circular approach. What we can do is we can start saying, this is our added focus and strategy, an innovative way of reducing costs, of addressing commodity price risk and volatility, of addressing supply chain risks, and also of anticipating regulatory trends and risks as well. These, we think, are a much better way to frame what we're doing with investors. The other area that I think is near and dear to the approach here, and I think should be intuitive for all of you in the audience, certainly, and you've seen it and experienced it, is managing financial risk and also including cost reduction. Now, what we found in our research is that there are a couple of ways that these kinds of approaches work. Number one is that they reduce the cost of getting debt and getting equity, so they make it cheaper. Sometimes just by 1 or 2%, but when we're talking about huge operations, reducing the cost of acquiring new equity by 1% makes a big, big difference, and is often much more than the budget that you're using to invest in these kinds of approaches. The second thing that it does is it works as a form of financial risk insurance that can be worth the equivalent of taking out a policy worth of hundreds of millions of dollars. And we can see many examples of this in which companies that are deemed to be leaders in this space are able to weather crises, whether reputational or otherwise, in terms of their share price recovery happens very quickly versus very slowly. Right? So when we start looking also at the cost reduction side, which is near and dear to both the CFO's heart and also your investors, we can see fantastic examples here. Many in this audience are going to be familiar, of course, with Walmart, with what they've done in terms of their zero waste to landfill goals. They're very much on track, over 80% in terms of their goals of meeting that target. And in their approach, which is very much integrated into their operations and thinking both internally and with their supply chain, for one particular year that they measured, I think they've increased this number, but they found a return on that investment of over $230 million in terms of what they've been able to achieve. Another great example that we've seen is GM. And GM has made the commitment to have 100 waste-free facilities, both manufacturing and otherwise, by 2020. I think they're ahead of that right now. And they've been able to, again, integrate this kind of process by thinking of this not as a sustainability approach, but as a business approach, an approach to greater efficiency, cost control, and strategy. And in doing that, they flipped the equation from spending $10 for every ton of waste that they managed down to $1. And then when they add the total cost savings and other revenue and reputation and brand building efforts that they have, they estimate that this program has returned around $1 billion over the time that they were measuring it. So the cost control opportunity is very exciting. Another example that I would mention is Unilever, which did a study of their approach and estimated savings of just over 250 million euros a year. So the financial risk, the cost control is something that is an extreme opportunity, of course, in this space. We can also now look to an area that is just starting to emerge in this space, the opportunity to generate sales. So what did we find in our research? We found that there's a potential for those who do this well, who market this effectively, and engage the conversation of sustainability effectively, not only with their B2C customers, but with their B2B customers. There's an opportunity to increase sales by anywhere from about 1 to 20%. Unilever is the poster child for doing this. They actually have done a study that credited a 26% increase in sales due to their sustainability activities. Now, there are a variety of ways that we get at this, and I'll get into that in a moment, but how does it work for what we're talking about? Well, the data is just starting to come in. I'm sure that several of you are aware of examples here. What we're starting to see is that B2C brands, for example, with Coca-Cola in the lead, are starting to feature this much more prominently in the conversation and dialogue that they're having with consumers through a variety of channels, including at the point of purchase, including on social media, and including on other kinds of media and broadcasting channels. And what they've done with their plant bottle it has influenced other great brands like Heinz, Ford Motor Company, Nike, P&G, and others like Best Buy. Doug has used the example a number of times of Best Buy experimenting with a rebate program, which turned out to be one of its most effective drivers to get their customers back in the store for their recycling and circular approaches with product. We're also seeing it can work with B2B as well, and there's no sort of more B2B company than Caterpillar. What they've focused on is a design for remanufacturing approach, which works with their customers to say bring back the equipment when they're at end of life or when they need replacement of major parts and components. And we're designing those components to be easily swapped in and swapped out, to be reused, reprocessed, and redeployed. And what they're finding is similar to the B2C model with Best Buy, that their customers are taking advantage of it, that they're coming back at a 94% rate, which gives them an opportunity for continued relationship, remarketing, and continued sales with that customer. So the B2B side works too. Now, what are the drivers of this? Because this also elicits certain kinds of skepticism. I think in Europe, it's a very different conversation than it is in the United States. Europe, consumers are much more aware and much further down the line than they are in the US. In the US, they're starting to catch up, but it's certainly not to the same extent that it would be in Europe. Now, there's a number of studies which are very exciting. We've seen studies that show anywhere from 60 to 90% of millennials are going to support sustainable brands. We've also seen that around 60 to 70% of the general population of consumers are going to support sustainable brands with their dollars too. I got to admit, in our research, I've become very, very skeptical of those kinds of results. The research that we like more actually looks at a more segmented kind of population. That what we think is a little bit more accurate is that about 1 to 20% of any brand or any company's customer base is going to be sort of latent sustainability, those who are sort of latently passionate about sustainability, and those who can be activated if they are appropriately engaged and if they are appropriately communicated to. If you activate them, they actually go beyond just purchasing. They become brand and sales ambassadors, sometimes to comical effect. There have been some very, very interesting studies where actually these 1 to 20% of passionate sustainability purchasers start going out and saying that one particular product is on the side of the angels and their competitors are our devils and their neighbors and friends and families are evil if they purchase from them. And so you can decide yourself, if you're a brand manager, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing to give them that kind of control. Generally, I think it's a good thing. Then we take that 20% and then we can look at another 1 to 40%, and these have sometimes been described as aspirationals. And these are individuals whose values have started to identify with things that relate and find appealing circular approaches, more sustainable approaches. What they need is a relationship with the company that they're purchasing from to say that you reflect my values and you actually allow me to express and feel better about myself through the purchasing relationship that I have with you. And so that's a slightly more tricky proposition in terms of how to engage them from a marketing perspective, but there's a tremendous opportunity. And what you can do is, for certain companies and industries, you can find that that 60% level of consumers and customers interested in what you're doing makes sense. So the key is to be able to have a more detailed and focused segmentation, not relying so much on these very, very appealing, but I think somewhat unrealistic and larger numbers that people use when they're sort of surveying in the privacy of their own home and not necessarily having to actually vote with their dollars. The next thing that I'd want to talk about is reputation. So reputation is something that I think boards intuitively and C-suites intuitively can understand in terms of the opportunity that this presents. What we found is that the reputation value that we can get from sustainability can actually be worth close to 10% of the entire market cap of the company. And this is why investors have become, over the years, so much more interested in intangible assets, brand, and reputation being there. And what we found is that your reputation for being a good citizen, sustainable, and certainly the circular approaches that you use is a key component of that. And so what we're finding is that circular approaches can be a great way to engage with those consumers and other key stakeholders that influence and make up your brand and reputation. We can see companies and networks like Danone and Nestle and others that are starting to feature this more prominently in terms of engaging their stakeholders on their packaging approaches to build reputation. Coca-Cola continues to be a leader in this area, talking about creative and innovative ways, for example, that they can use technology, RFID, tagging to allow recycling to happen easier and being seen as a leader in this area. Last but not least is HR. Our findings were very exciting here as well. We can find that more sustainable companies can reduce turnover, sometimes as much as up to 50%, which has tremendous cost-saving opportunity for companies. We also see that it can increase productivity by 10 to 15% and employee engagement scores by around 8%. And so the circular economy approaches that we're talking about here, we've seen a fantastic way to engage your employees, make them feel more connected and intuitively engaged. I think the key thing here is to make sure that the way that we engage them is something that is appealing. That to ask your companies, if we think about our own lives, and it's the same with our employees, if I am told, if I feel scolded, if I feel imposed upon in terms of the recycling that I'm asked to do in my home life, I'm not going to comply very actively. And we see the same thing happening inside the workplace. But if we connect those employees to a greater purpose, to a greater vision and mission in terms of what they're doing, allow them to connect to their peers so they have that peer-to-peer network engagement and see that they're doing this through a team spirit type of activity, then participation in supporting these activities can increase manifold and really support what you're trying to do. So the main takeaway from our research is that we have found that it is indeed very possible to have our cake and eat it too, that we can actually use these kinds of approaches to drive greater business results, greater business success over the short, medium, and long term, and we can do so by making real impact for our communities, for individuals, and for the environment. And I think that is a very worthy conversation to have and a very worthwhile thing to wake up for and go to work. Thank you so much for listening.